Welcome into the Autzen Audibles podcast. I'm at Prehm. Erik Skopil on the show as always. Welcome to a Thursday edition, one of the last days of the month of February. Getting ready for March Madness, spring football, baseball, and softball are kicking it off into full gear. Both have big series this coming weekend. Softball's at home, baseball's on the road in Las Vegas for a big marquee kind of neutral site round robin tournament. But the women secured a big win on the road at Purdue. They look like they've kind of entrenched themselves into the tournament. The men, we were just talking about off the air, another signature win for this team over Wisconsin at home, another win over a tournament team, showing the fight that you want to see from a program going through a rough patch. But nonetheless, good news for the men there too.
Yeah.
But we're gonna turn to football. Spring football starts in about 3 weeks, 2.5 weeks. And earlier this week, we talked about some storylines to play out during spring ball going in, kind of what where heads were at. Erik's got a story up now of the 10 Ducks who have kind of the most to prove here or need to step up, as the wording you used, going into spring football. And I'm curious because we're going to discuss this. Some of it will be a little bit of an overlap from last week or from earlier this week's podcast of guys that, storylines to watch. But you've got some heavy hitters on this list. You've also got some guys stepping into bigger roles. Just kind of what was the parameters that someone or a group of people had to kind of check the box to be included in this list for you?
Yeah, and thanks before we jump in, I should acknowledge that this isn't just players. There's coaches on here. There are like full position groups. The 10 Ducks is kind of it's more like 10 groups or individual,
Right.
you know what I mean? Like it's a broader range than just 10 individual players. So probably good to get that out of the way before we dive into this. And you're like, what, Erik, you just talked about 7 Ducks in that particular position group alone. Now we've talked about 23 different Duck players. So there's going to be a little bit of that, but no, these are just individuals or kind of position groups that I look at and say, man, this Oregon team, we know what their goals are. Like no one's really holding back at this point. Like Oregon has this whole, if you go down the checklist of things this program needs to accomplish, there's one item really left, and that's the aim every season. And so kind of with that in, kind of in mind, I broke it down thinking in those terms of like, if this is going to be a championship caliber football team when the season matters most, but more than anything, if this is going to be that kind of team, where do they need to get better? Where do they need to make sure that they're solid and strong? And that's kind of where I focus. I mean, you'll see I'm focused on the positions that matter the most and making sure Oregon is at its best at those positions. And again, a lot of this is going to start in spring, and you hope that this is where some of that progress to becoming a national championship caliber program or team, I think we think they're already there, but just to kind of solidifying that, I guess, is sort of the aim here. So yeah, I think it's pretty fun to look through and talk about, especially as we now, as you said on Tuesday, we're now talking in the context of a new season, a new team. It's 2026. There's reason to be, anticipating major strides made from some of these individuals, or that's possible. And I think that makes it pretty fun when you just kind of talk about like, hey, these are some guys we think need to have big seasons in 5 or 6 months from now, but we're setting the stage early. We're setting the stage now in February and obviously through March and April as they get through spring camp.
The first grouping you listed, I think, is also the one that we should start with because it's probably the most important. Newly appointed coordinators, Drew Maringer, Chris Hampton. We talked a little bit about it last podcast, just kind of the storylines around these guys, and they have to step up. They have to be good hits. If they're not good hires or promotions, we should say, things don't go smoothly for them on either side of the football. Oregon season probably doesn't live up to expectations.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can be cut and dry here because we did touch on this on Tuesday, but what we said then is true still, obviously, a couple of days later. I mean, these are the 2 most important coaches on Oregon staff, not named Dan Lanning, and they're coaches who've not been in these roles at Oregon before. And Oregon's offense and defense's success is very much tied and relied upon these 2 guys being up for the task. And frankly, to a certain degree, you probably want to hope that they are upgrades, even though maybe that feels like a little bit of a pie in the sky. You don't assume You've got, the co-OC and co-DC on a staff who are better equipped to run those positions than the offensive coordinator or defensive coordinator, who, of course, now they're replacing. But Oregon has not been at its best in the biggest of moments the last couple of years. Obviously, some huge wins, some marquee wins. We talked about it on our Tuesday show, and I think anybody who's just being honest is like, Oregon's lost very, very few games under Coach Lanning. This is a program that is right on the doorstep, but hey, you need to have the coaching in place to win the big games, and we'll see. And I think the positive here is there is a familiarity and continuity in place with both of these guys. Players on the teams know them. They're not learning their personalities. They're probably not learning much from a schematic perspective, but they also have to have trust that these guys are going to be able to be, relied on the biggest of stages. And that starts in spring. And I would imagine this is a process that is already been very much ongoing, and that Dan, from probably even in December when it was clear Will and Tosh were gone, where it was pointing, hey, these guys are going to be in these positions next year. Everybody be prepared to get behind them. But now it's kind of, hey, this is your first camp officially in these positions, and you guys better be ready.
Next on the list is going to be another guy that we talked about. I think you put this perfectly in your story. It's Evan Stewart, Oregon's receiver. They clearly won plenty of games without him in 2025. He didn't play at all last season due to injury.
Mm-hmm.
But winning games in September, in October, November, those are obviously important, because if you don't win those, you can't get to the playoffs. But Oregon's kind of beyond the, we made the playoffs. Yes, call it a success. That sounds very elitist, very different mindset from what the traditional Oregon fan base has grown up with. But that's just the reality. Getting to the playoffs is a great accomplishment. You don't devalue it, but Oregon's goals are bigger than that, and they're bigger than getting to the playoffs and being content with whatever happens. It's getting to the playoffs, winning games in January so that you can play late into the month of January, and that's where Evan Stewart comes into play.
It is, and again, the big picture question for me here is just, what is his availability, and can he be the player he was in 2024? I think Oregon's receiving core is going to be awesome regardless. And that was kind of the one of the things I wrote about, is like, hey, Oregon, this team won 13 games last year. And at a point in the season, they basically had two receivers that they could trust on. That was where they were. And so I'm not going into 26 saying Evan Stewart, if he's available, if he's not available, that's going to determine the regular season. But I also say, kind of the point we're just making on the coordinators, we know what the aspirations for these teams are, and being good in September, October, and even into November is not where their sights are set. They want to be playing into January and playing their best football. And frankly, Evan Stewart, based upon his history here, I think back to that Ohio State game in 2024, he's been a difference maker in moments like that when the competition goes up. So getting him back would be a great start. Getting him available, I should say, would be a great start. And then getting him to a place where it feels like it's comparable production, comparable talent, comparable impact on the field would be the next. And I think we're going to have a much better idea of where he's at in spring. And hopefully there's clarity, because if there's not clarity again, you run the risk of getting into the summer and being like, okay, here we go again, another offseason where we just don't know what this guy's deal is going to be. And that's not on Evan. That's just based upon health and injury and some things where, hey, there's not going to be full clarity.
Yeah, if Oregon wants to take that next step offensively, obviously they can feel an elite team without him. But when you throw him into the mix and he becomes just another guy, like we saw in that Ohio State game, or we saw in that Penn State game in 2024, or
Boise State had a huge game as well.
Yeah,
a couple
Boise
big catches.
State, he had a huge game. If you can throw that Evan Stewart into the mix, I mean, what is the defense going to do when you trot out DeCorian Moore, Evan Stewart, Jamari Johnson, and let's say Jeremiah McClellan? You can't double everybody. And if you drop everybody back, you're going to be able to run the football highly effectively. And so that's where you look at Oregon in 2026, where if Oregon wants to have the most feared offense in college football, which I think could happen, you need Evan Stewart to get back to being 2024 version and not missing out on the season. Next on the list here, another mainstay, another very popular name for Oregon football, Mateo Uyungale as an outside linebacker edge guy. I'm really curious here because he's an all-conference caliber guy. Had he declared for the NFL draft this year, probably would have been a borderline first-round draft pick or maybe a second-round pick. But he's on this list of he's got to step up in 2026 for you.
Well, I think one thing just to take a step back is I had 10 slots to pick, and one of them was always going to be one of these returning defensive linemen because I find that group to be kind of the engine of this defense, right? Like they've got 4 guys back that we all think are big-time NFL guys, but guys that have been productive throughout their careers. And, I thought Oregon's defensive front at times last year was one of the better we'd seen at this school. But then there was kind of the glaring issue with sack production and getting after the quarterback. And that's what kind of tilted this towards Mateo for me of why he was the player we're highlighting here. This guy led the Big Ten in sacks in 2024 in the regular season. He had 10.5. He only had 6 this last year, and I wrote in the story, like PFF will say, like, hey, he had more pressure. His pass rush grade was better. Like, all those things can be true. Like you can say he maybe like cumulatively he's had a stronger or a more impactful pass rush season in 25 than 24. But sack production dipped a lot, and that wasn't just him. Like I've got in the story here, 40 sacks in 14 games in 2024, 30 sacks in 15 games in 2025, right? You go on a per game basis, you're going from about 3 per game to down to 3 or down to 2 per game. And that's significant, when you get into these bigger moments. And so Mateo is, we know he's a prideful guy. He's a guy who still has a chance to finish really high on the school's all-time sack record list because he's been impactful for 3 full seasons already, to start his career. This isn't a shot at him, but I think for this defense to get to where it needs to get, he needs to be somebody who demands a little bit more respect. And maybe that's kind of twisting things because part of the reason the production was down, I think, was because he probably did demand respect. But I think people's perception of Mateo maybe externally is a little different than it was in 2024. Like, he wasn't the best edge player on this football team last year. That was Tatum. And so I don't think it's unreasonable to expect this is a guy who can take a leap and really improve this defense. And so get into spring, hopefully he takes a step, and you get into fall and go, man, this is the guy we saw in 2024. This is a guy who's one of the best pass rushers in the country.
Yeah, going up to the level that we kind of expected in 2025 is going to be a big thing for Mateo. Or if it's Tatum Tuioti or somebody else, you need to be able to attack and get to the quarterback and create sacks, create pressure. I think some of that, the lack of that, was probably due to opponents saying, we're just not going to give the quarterback the ball for 4 or 5 seconds in his hands. We're going to get it out quick to prevent the sack. But you still got to figure out a way to create those. You still got to get pressures, even when they do that. Mateo's your best guy there to do it. You got to see him step up. Now, next guy on the list, newcomer, and It's not just a transfer portal newcomer. Those will be included on this list as well. But Emmanuel Nacho, true freshman, makes the list here. Oregon doesn't start a ton of true freshmen. It's very rare for a true freshman to start on the offensive line in the regular season. I think you pulled the last time it's happened. It's been a while. It should explain who that was. But why did Emmanuel Nacho make this list? And why is he so important for a unit that it has to replace multiple starters?
Yeah, so Poncho started as a true freshman in 2023, but that was only in the bowl game. You have to go back to 2021 to, ironically, his predecessor, Jackson Powers Johnson, who started a couple of games that season. And then you have to go back to 2018 to get to a guy who started the first game of the season, and that was none other than Penei Sewell. So you hate to group Ihanacho with JPJ and Penei Sewell, who were both, and in Sewell's case, a first-round pick, JPJ, a second-round pick, had been, discussed as a possible first-round pick. Guys that went off the board really early, and in Sewell's case, one of the best offensive linemen in all of football for a couple straight years with the Lions. But at the same time, going back to what the exercise was of trying to identify what this team needs from a perspective of like, hey, to win a championship, they've got to shore up their tackles. And the ceiling of Emmanuel Ihanacho, to me, is so much higher than anybody else on this team at that particular spot. I think he's a right tackle to start his career based upon, his size and athleticism. Maybe at some point he can be a left tackle, but this is a guy who's like 6'7", 6'8", 350, a total road grader. And while I think we both tried to be careful in the past with, predicting or projecting a true freshman start, especially on the offensive line, because we got bit, the two of us, by Kingsley Suamatia like 4 years ago. And I have not made any projections like this since, but this is the kind of cat who's different. And I really think like if we're going to look up, in 10 months from now and say, man, what's the story of this 2026 Oregon football season? I think if they don't get tackle shored up, this could be one of the places we point to for why it's a disappointment. And on the flip side, if they do get it shored up, we might be pointing and saying, hey, this team doesn't get this far if not for this true freshman making this step. So I just think he is such a high ceiling player. And if he can be ready to go in 2026, I think that puts this team in a much more advantageous position up front.
I wonder how much they treat Emmanuel Nacho like they did Josh Connerly Jr. his freshman year, where they had some new starters along the line. He was clearly going to be a regular contributor for the team, Connerly, but he didn't really start. But he was like clearly their top option off the bench if someone needed to come in. The door's probably more wide open, though, for a Nacho to start a game in the regular season than it was Connerly. And that's not to say Nacho is the better player than Connerly was. That would be a fun debate to have. I don't know what the answer
is. It's a reasonable one.
Yeah, I don't know what the answer would be, but it feels like there's less proven commodities at the offensive line, which could open the door for a Nacho to maybe take the job, where Connerly, you knew, like, man, you're going to have a perfect fall camp. You're going to need to be perfect early in the season to earn the starter job. It's not out of the realm, but the deck is kind of stacked against you, but you're going to play. It's an interesting storyline. I think Nacho's definitely got the chance to do it. Is he going to be able to beat out a Fox Crater or a Janoris Wilson or a Michael Bennett, or can he? Is it maybe best for him to position change and play guard early on? I don't know. His ceiling, though, you're right. Like, it's as high as maybe anyone on the roster, and you've got to see where it can take him.
Yeah, it's especially the highest at tackle. And just a good point I'm bringing up Connerly. I was just pulling up like where he was in the two deep in 2022, and TJ Bass was the left tackle for most of that season. That's a guy who's in the NFL starting games for the Cowboys as an interior lineman, but still, that's an NFL caliber, starting caliber offensive lineman he was working behind. And he was a guy who'd started the previous season too, who's a returning starter. It is a different situation for Ihanacho, where he comes in and look, Isaiah World and Alex Harkey are gone. Like, both tackles are gone. Oregon was a player for Jordan Seaton. I don't think by accident. That doesn't necessarily suggest, I think, that they're totally screwed because they didn't get him, because they have talented young players. But like, they were on the market for a top tackle for a reason, and that's because they don't have any returner starters coming back. So I look at Ihanacho as, again, like such a high ceiling possible player here at tackle, where if you could get him ready, I think that's a huge deal, because he's not fighting against a returning proven starter. He's fighting against guys like Janoris Wilson, who started a game last year at right tackle, and I thought looked pretty good there. But could Ihanacho be the better player there? Could that be the outcome? I wouldn't bet against it at all. In fact, that would be my expectation based upon recruiting ranking. So we will certainly see here. And if we get out, I'll put it this way: I think if we get out of spring and it's like this guy's not even close, we're going to be having a pretty get real conversation about where this offensive line ceiling can be in 2026.
Next on the list here is probably the most prolific, well-known player on the roster, Dante Moore. Enters his junior year, enters his second year as the team's starting quarterback, won the job last season. How real was that competition can be up for debate. But nonetheless, he returns, and the expectations kind of exponentially increase tenfold just because he's back. Doesn't matter really who's around him. The expectations with Dante Moore back is you're in the playoffs, you're competing for a Big Ten championship game appearance, you're competing for a Big Ten championship. You should be in contention for the number 1 seed. He's got to live up to the billing.
Yeah, things would be different if quarterback didn't feel like it was kind of a weak spot, right? If it didn't feel like quarterback was a position that Oregon actually was losing because of at times in that Indiana game. You know, that game starts with a pick six. There's a couple other turnovers in the game, some of which were on him, some of which maybe you don't have to point the finger, but just in general, he didn't play well in the 2 biggest games of 2025. And you come out of it going like, hey, there's some pretty clear areas for him to get better. And obviously that was part of his calculus for making a decision about what he was going to do from a football perspective in 2026. Like, you know, the NFL draft was right there for him. If he wanted to take that step, I think he made the right decision, especially coming out of that game of like, hey, there's some growth areas that I definitely need to take. Like when I'm playing against NFL caliber defenses or talent in Indiana, I don't look very good. What's this going to look like when I'm facing this for 17 consecutive regular season weeks as a 20-year-old, 21-year-old quarterback? And I think obviously this whole season is going to come down to if he can get better. And like, you know, if we're ranking these 1 through 10, and this was more kind of done out of order, there wasn't necessarily like this is the most important. I think Dante Moore is the most important name on this list.
Yep.
He has the highest floor probably of anybody here, or pretty close, just because like what we saw last year was good enough to win 13 games, and it was good enough to win 13 games with a ton of adversity too, right? Like receivers going down left and right. You know, Kenyon Sadiq's in and out of lineup, offensive line issues. The last couple of games there, they had some running back injuries and everything. And all the questions he's having to handle with like, hey, is this a legitimate number 1 overall draft pick? Are you going to come back? Like I thought he handled himself really well for the most part. But again, we're talking about winning a national championship. And if Oregon is going to do so, he needs to play better in the bigger games at the very end of the season against the best competition. So I think he's deserving of a spot here. And frankly, I anticipate he takes a big step based upon what we know of Dante Moore and the person he is to this point. But without question, coming out of the spring, we're going to be picking apart that spring game and going like, hey, did Oregon's defense do enough to put pressure on him and confuse him and challenge him? And how did he handle those situations? Because this guy looked awesome for 13 out of 15 games or a lot, you know, maybe not quite that many, but a lot of those games. But unfortunately, the ones that we're going to be thinking about the most was not up to par.
Let's take a quick break. We come back, we'll dive into the second half of this list of players and coaches and groups of positions. All right, welcome back to the Autzen Audibles podcast. Next on the list, we talked about it, transfer portal, superstar player, one of the Big Ten's best. Coy Parrish, a safety from Minnesota, transfers in. He has the responsibility to probably be the replacement for Dylan Thieneman, who is off the NFL after 1 season. Parrish comes to the Ducks with the same kind of similar pedigree as Thieneman, with 2 years of all Big Ten experience, arguably one of the better players in the conference in the secondary, one of the best national players too. And he's going to be expected to kind of plug and play in Thieneman's spot. And those are big shoes to fill because as we all saw play out throughout the 2025 season, I felt like Dylan Thieneman entered Oregon's 2025 season with extremely high expectations. It's going to be difficult to exceed those. And yet somehow he did. He was even better, in my opinion, than expected. Made clutch plays, 2 interceptions, 1 games at Penn State, the one that's most popular and well known. The Washington interception, stealed it up in Seattle as well. And his ability to play kind of like as a hybrid linebacker really changed this defense and to allow them to do some different things. And Parrish steps in where he's going to have to fill a similar role to a degree.
I mean, yeah, if you want an illustration of exceeding expectations, how about the last couple of days, Matt and I have both posted some content over on the site that Dylan Thieneman may be drafted ahead of Kenyon Sadiq. These are not our opinions. These are opinions of, I think Mel Kiper said this, Bucky Brooks said this, PFF said this. There are people out here in the industry right now who are saying, hey, Dylan Thieneman's a legitimate first-round NFL draft pick. He's not going to be the first safety off the board. That'll be Caleb Downs. But he might be the first duck off the board. And I don't think any of us really expected that for most of the season. But based upon how he performed, that's a reasonable thing to suggest. And based upon the traits and everything, all the intangibles, I totally get it. And that's kind of, to me, it's not so much the player on the field for spring that I think is important for Coy, but also like, I just remember last spring, it seemed like every interview session we came out of, somebody had talked about how Dylan Thieneman was like the first guy in the building, last guy out, was just this leader, like it instantly came in and kind of had that mentality of almost like, I remember Dylan Gabriel had kind of something with these Dylans spelled with an O, where these guys show up as transfers and just kind of like win over the locker room. That was Dylan Gabriel, obviously, in 24, coming in from Oklahoma, had kind of the urgency of like, I've only got 1 year. I've got to figure this out. Dylan Thieneman was kind of the same deal last year. I think it's imperative Coy Parrish does the same thing, in part because just like Dylan Thieneman, and I know these players are a year older, it's a really young secondary. Like Oregon is going to start sophomores potentially at three of the, they started 3 freshmen 90% of the games in 2025. Those guys are now going to be sophomores. Like they need that veteran guy, the guy who's been at this for a while. And while we know Coy Parrish is a heck of an athlete and a really good football player, I'm very fascinated to see if he can kind of fill in some of that Dylan Thieneman, kind of those intangibles, that locker room presence, all those kind of things that are really important that maybe get overlooked a little bit. I'm going to be curious just to see if we're having those same conversations as we get into April here, where we start talking to players and they're like, yeah, Coy's been this, that, or the other. I think it's really important that he kind of is that sort of a presence for this defense.
Moving back to the offensive side of the football, a new projected starter for Oregon. I think it's safe to say he's a projected starter. Maybe he gets beat out, but that's offensive tackle Fox Crater. He made 1 start for Oregon in 2025. It was the USC game at left tackle in place of Isaiah World. He came in the second half of the Peach Bowl and replaced Isaiah World, which we ended up learning major knee injury for Isaiah World. And quite honestly, in both instances, Fox Crater, you would not have expected that he was a guy that was making his first career start or playing really like at the highest level of college football to his career at that point, and it being the first time ever in that kind of a situation. He looked like a seasoned vet instead of a redshirt freshman. But nonetheless, he goes into 2026 where Oregon tried to go after Jordan Seaton. I think it was one of those they felt like they probably had to because of Seaton's pro potential and likelihood of being a top draft pick in the 2027 NFL draft should he declare. He was just too good of a player to not go after. But they were really content with going into the offseason without really bringing in a portal transfer at the tackle position, at least a superstar player like they've done the last couple of years, because of guys like Fox Crater.
Yeah, and left tackle is a super important position, right? Like anyone protecting the blind side is going to be somebody who you need to be a top tier talent. And hey, like I thought Isaiah World, and kind of similar to Dante Moore, and like 80% of the games was really, really good and asserted himself better than he had at Nevada. And he was such an interesting, and not to make this all about Isaiah, but it's just kind of an odd career arc where he was not a superstar at Nevada, but like a very good player. But based upon some of the physical tools and the intangibles, suddenly he skyrockets up and he's like the top transfer player in the entire country most of the cycle. And then he gets to Oregon, and I'll be honest, like I think it was probably a little underwhelming overall, just because of the big game moments that weren't maybe what you hoped or expected based upon some of the stuff physically he had at his disposal. Oregon now has to go and see if they can find somebody who's as good, if not better. And Fox Crater feels like a more than worthy replacement here. He's just also somebody who, again, hasn't done this. And so if you're playing one of the most important positions on offense and you've never been a full-time starter before, it's important that these months kind of go your way. And I think Fox is a guy who if he's going to be the starter at left tackle, this is going to have to be a really big March and April for him. And I'm kind of curious just to see what he looks like, how polished he looks by the time we get to the season. Like what kind of growing pains are there? Because the reality is Oregon could enter 2026 with a redshirt sophomore in Crater at one tackle and a true freshman in Emmanuel Ihanacho at the other tackle spot, right? Like that could be the big question is like, hey, these young tackles, unexperienced guys, highly regarded guys, but are they ready? And Fox, just like Manny, who we were talking about a moment ago, needs a big spring here, needs a big summer to kind of get him ready to take over this job.
I'm really intrigued by Crater because I think it's been a while since Oregon's kind of had a had a year where multiple players along the offensive line are homegrown, meaning they signed them out of high school and they went through the progressions and they never left for starters. Like, I'm trying to think, when's the last time Oregon's had two guys in the same year be homegrown players and be stars? Is it 23 with
Well, I mean,
Poncho and Connerly?
Poncho and Connerly the next year would qualify, and even last year, I guess Poncho and Iuli would qualify.
True.
But at both tackles, you'd have to go back a really long time.
Probably 22 or 2021, kind of around the time when you've got Bass or Brady Ayalo and
well, I was gonna say, like, does Bass qualify because he was a JUCO? Like, if you're talking guys who were freshmen all the way through at both tackle spots, you do have to go back, I think, to the Throckmorton, Lemieux, that kind of era of offensive line, 2021, 22.
Yeah. So it's been a while since they've had an elite talent at tackle that's homegrown at both spots. Crater's going to give you an opportunity to do that. Next on the list is the reserve defensive lineman. I'm happy that you made this group because obviously they bring back their top unit, but the guys behind every position, second string, are all gone. They all went to the portal. They all wanted more playing time. Totally understandable. Some of them are projected probably NFL draft picks if they have good years in their 1 year as a starter at their respective schools. And mind you, we're talking about guys that went to like Alabama because they couldn't play at Oregon. Crazy to think about, but Oregon reloaded. They hit the portal. They found some talent. They found some diamonds in the rough type guys, and they've got to step up.
Following up on that, by the way, 2019 was the last year of Throckmorton and Sewell, and I would think that would be the last time you had two guys who were freshmen all the way through. It blows my mind, by the way, Matt, that we've been doing this long, that Throckmorton and Sewell was 7 years ago. That's crazy. Yeah, I mean, when you talk about the offseason, I think a lot of people, I think this is a fair way to frame it. I wrote it in the story, but a lot of people feel this way of like retaining the starting 4 defensive linemen was probably one of the biggest wins, along with keeping Dante Moore. The biggest loss, though, may have been losing all the depth behind those guys, right? You know, they lose their third, fourth, and fifth most played edge or interior linemen. They lose their third and fourth most played edge players. So 5 of their most important defensive linemen who aren't starters, probably your 5 most, are all gone. And they all could have been back, but you lost them to the portal. So this is a year of like, hey, we've got to replace the depth. I think everybody feels really good about, the snaps where Mateo, Tatum, Amari, and Barra on the field together. Like those should be snaps where Oregon is able to compete with anybody in the country. But what about those snaps when they need rest? And that's a pretty decent amount of time. I mean, like Green and Gray average 18 snaps per game. Purchase averaged a little bit more than that. Even Ashton Porter played 15, 16 snaps a lot of the time per game. So, I've got a list here of guys like, and this is why it was a group as opposed to, just a player or two. But like, I think DeAndre Robinson from North Carolina is a name that like that has to hit. That has to be an addition that matters. Aiden Breland and Matthew Johnson, those guys are pretty, Breland in particular was like a 5-star recruit or at least a high 4-star. I think it was very finished. Like that needs to feel like they've connected on that and that he's taken a step and he can contribute. Off the edge, Elijah Rushing and Breland were the 2 headliners back in 2024. I haven't seen anything from those 2 guys. Like I think Oregon's clearly
there.
Yeah, it is. And I think Oregon's made a bet that these guys are going to be productive players. And so far they haven't been. And in 2026, They have to be. And I think of a couple other guys off the edge, Nasir Wyatt and Anthony Tank Jones. Like, you've got highly regarded guys you can be excited about that are stepping in here, but they need to really take advantage of this spring. And I think with both Wyatt and Jones in particular, they need to put on some weight. Like, Wyatt was, I think, 228 on the roster in 25. Like, he probably needs to be closer to 235, 240. And Jones signed at 230. He needs to probably be up in the 240, 245, 250 range too. So getting those guys physically ready is important, because they need these guys to play off the edge. Mateo and Tatum can't play every down. We saw that in 2025. And who are those players? Like, these are the names that should matter, and we'll see if they do.
DeAndre Robinson feels, though, like, in my eyes, the one that has to hit the most, because you lost Porter, you lost Gray, and what made Oregon's interior D line so good last year, in my opinion, was Terrence Green, not Porter. You still lost Porter, but Terrence Green was the other interior defensive lineman. There was very little drop off when Bear Alexander or Amari Washington had to come off the field. And quite honestly, at different parts of the year, Gray or Green were better than those guys, or one of those guys. And so you need to go into 2026 knowing that whoever emerges, and it's probably going to have to be DeAndre Robinson most likely, whoever emerges as your third best defensive tackle, he's got to be a stud. He's got to be a guy that you can collectively say, look, we don't know when it's going to happen, but he's going to get his name called whenever he becomes draft eligible, puts his name on the draft. Like, whether it's a 7th round pick or a 3rd round pick, that's the type of level of production you need from that player. Robinson's probably the front runner, but I would also probably sit here and tell you, don't sleep on Matt Johnson.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be a future star for Oregon, whether it's in 2026 or beyond. Real high on him as well.
Matt, before we move to the next one, just out of curiosity, if Robinson's the interior lineman that you think is most important, which of those, and I guess it doesn't have to be, but which of those edge players that I mentioned in there with Rushing and Wyatt and Tank Jones do you think is most important to take a step?
Rushing.
Yeah, I agree.
Because we kind of know what Wyatt can do. And I also don't think it's fair to look at Wyatt and say, we need you to be this just absolute stout defensive run stopper.
Yeah, this is never going to be what he is.
Correct. So Rushing is the one that's got the body profile to still be a pass rush menace, but also have the size and the physicality that's needed to be an every down run stuffer off the edge as well. So I would probably look at Rushing. Obviously, there are other names that you could throw out there, Tank Jones being the most obvious one, but I'd much rather bank on a returning guy being able to play on a regular basis than a newcomer that's a true freshman.
And I guess I agree. And the other part of it is you'd hate to feel like 3 years into the Elijah Rushing thing, you just didn't get much of any payoff for you know, and I hate that we're talking about in those terms, but if you look at this as an asset, you know, you took this kid, he was a 5-star, he was expected to come in and be a contributor, and we're 2 years in and it just hasn't happened. Obviously he's behind really high end players, so I'm not faulting him for that, but the seas have parted for him this year to be in the 2 deep and maybe play your third most snaps off the edge on the team. If that doesn't happen and we come out of the season going like, oh, I don't know, it's going to feel like this was a pretty big whiff. And hey, that's could be a lot to, you know, that could prove to be a lot of people at fault, but it would certainly, we'd have a conversation about like, oh man, this 2024 class headliner just didn't work. And that hasn't been the case with very many of Oregon's recruits, by the way, especially the top tier ones. They got a pretty good track record with hitting. Rushing is certainly one right now where you go like, yeah, it just hasn't popped the way you kind of expected.
Next on the list, special teams coordinator Joe Lorig. There's a lot at play here because there's a lot of positions open. All 3 of them are open. Yep. And so he's got to hit on the guys that he's brought in.
Yeah, and we hit this on Tuesday, so again, not going to belabor it too much here, but I picked Lorig because they got a new long snapper. They got a new punter. They got a new kicker. that new punter is going to probably be the new holder. So you talk about the operations here. They are completely reworking it. And it's not that they're reworking it with guys who are on the roster who know each other. It's that they're going to be working it with guys who've never met before they get into, obviously they've met at this point, but guys that haven't spent any time together playing football together. It's important that this group takes a step, that this group gets comfortable, that the process that is required to get the ball to the right spot, to get the ball in the air, it was working seamlessly. So Joe Lorig has, I think, won people's trust. Hopefully the last couple of years, they've been much improved in special teams. I'm not saying it's been absolutely perfect. Definitely room to grow, but there's also the possibility here with so much turnover that things that kind of take a pretty big step back. And you're hoping that's not the case here, because we saw as recently as Dan Lanning's first season in 2022, what it looks like when you don't have a punter you can trust. And if it's just one of those operations, things get pretty ugly pretty fast. Yeah.
Last guy on this list is a returning starter, and it's a perfect way to end it because it's a guy that went from rotation piece to starter to now potential star player across college football at that spot, and that's linebacker Jerry Mixon. I'm sky high on this guy. Every year he's gotten better and better. This year he had the year most people were thinking Devin Jackson was going to have the last 2 seasons.
Exactly. Yep.
Turned into a stud, reliable player next to Bryce Betcher. And now the question becomes, can you take that next step and become I'm not saying like you have to replace copy and paste Bryce Betcher's career, but can you be that guy? Can you be the alpha? Can you be the guy that sets the tone? Can you be the guy that gets everyone from a culture standpoint ready to go? Be the emotional leader, be the on-field leader that this defense will need to have, and replace what Bryce Betcher did for you in 2025 and previous years.
I mean, and we don't have full clarification on if he'll be this guy or not, but somebody has to be the green dot where you're the one as a play caller on the field. And that was Bryce last year. We don't have to go over Bryce's career, but this is a guy who finished with 136 tackles last year, which was the most since 1979. That was before either of us were on this earth. Kind of puts into perspective. He had a very special season last year, even though I know there's some people. He's a funny guy. He's, by the way, taking part in the combine in like 90 minutes. I'm fascinated to see how Bryce does. But Jerry's got more on his plate this year, I think, is just a pretty easy way of putting it. Is a guy who, I was so impressed by the growth he had even over the course of the back half of last season, especially as a run defender. But like, he needs to now be the leader of this room. This is his group. Like, and he's, to your point, Matt, he has a chance to be one of the better backers in the country. I do think that's true. That progress this spring has got to be huge, and he needs to take seriously, like, not only am I the leader in the locker room, but I'm the leader on the field. Like, this is my job. I'm the quarterback of the defense. And that was not a role he was asked to carry last year. I think it's going to be a role he's asked to carry in 26. And so it's a big spring for him to kind of emerge as that guy who the players on defense look around and go, hey, that's our new leader at that second level. So, and the other part is, like, he might need to bring along a Braden Platt or a Dylan Williams, one of these younger linebackers, if they end up, outplaying or outperforming a Devin Jackson. And that puts a little bit, I don't want to say pressure, but that puts more on his plate too, where he's also maybe having to keep track of a more talented or a more capable player, but maybe a player who's not been on the field quite as much if they turn to a Platt or a Williams, who are guys we think we're pretty high on, but who have, I think, collectively probably like 70 career snaps or something like that.
Yeah, I've said it before, I'm sky high on Jerry Mixon. And if Oregon's defense wants to be elite and improve on where it was last season, Jerry Mixon's going to have a bigger role and have a bigger impact, a bigger fingerprint on this program. And I think he will. I mean, I don't know about you, Erik, but I think this is one of the ones where we look at things and say, this guy's got to be better, or this position's got to be better. I don't know what it is, but I got full confidence in this guy being that next dude for Oregon at linebacker. And quite honestly, Michalowski, the linebackers coach, I know there's been some, displeasure maybe of not, excuse me, going after a portal guy the last couple of cycles. He has quietly started to develop a very strong NFL reputation, whether it was Jamal Hill a couple of years ago, who's got drafted, is in the NFL. Jeffrey Bossa got drafted last season, is in the NFL. Now Bryce Betcher will get his name called 3 years in a row of having a linebacker picked in the NFL draft is a pretty good sign of a very healthy and progressive development forward operating unit. And Jerry Mixon's got an opportunity where, we're ahead of the cart ahead of the horse here a little bit, but it's got an opportunity to be the fourth straight year of a linebacker being drafted out of Oregon. That's a very good sign for where things are at for the offense, for the linebacker group for Oregon's defense.
Well, and to your point, I think if he's not a guy who gets drafted in 2027 in that draft, we're going to be saying, this linebacker group didn't play to its level. This is probably a concern, because not to put too much pressure on Jerry, but like part of the reason I picked him was if he's not the guy, I don't know who is. And I've already had enough time kind of breaking down my thoughts on Devin Jackson, but I feel really good about Jerry being the guy based upon how he played last year. If it's not him, I don't know who it is. And that's where you get a little bit concerned. And my linebacker for me remains on defense kind of the biggest question mark going into the season.
All right, that's going to do it for us on this edition of the Autzen Audibles podcast. You can go to DuckTerritory.com for more coverage of Oregon football, also Oregon's basketball teams. Their spring sports are getting into full gear. Now's a good time to join the site as well with spring football starting up if you haven't joined in a while, or if you're looking to get back into the fold. So highly encourage you to do that. We'll be back next week with more shows covering probably a little bit of basketball and probably some football as well. But you've been listening to the Autzen Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.